Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me along today to be part of this conference. What I hope to do in the next 25 minutes or so is to give you a wee tour around a year in the life of a bat, specifically looking at the different roosts that bats will use at different times of the year, looking at the type of structures they use, the reasons they use them, and how important they are in the grand scheme of being a bat. So firstly, what is a roost? What do we call a bat roost? Well, it's easily described as a structure or place that a bat uses for shelter or protection. Now, this is a very wide-reaching description, of course, but a very important one. Another important thing to bear in mind about roosts is that legally they are protected irrespective of whether or not the bats are still there. So for some species, like birds, for example, the nests are only protected while they're active during the breeding season. However, for bats, those roosts, no matter what time of year they use them, are protected throughout the year, which is very important for bats and, well, for bat conservation. Now, let's just have a quick whistle stop through a year in the life of a bat. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but just as a reminder. So if we start in winter here, bats, of course, are busy hibernating in winter. All of our British bats are insectivorous and will feed on invertebrates that are around, obviously, when it's warm. So when it's cold, they have to do something else. And instead of migrating, like things like swallows might do, they choose to hibernate. So this is a state where they reduce all of their bodily functions, their metabolism, their respiratory rate, their heart rate, everything decreases right down to the absolute bare minimum to allow them to conserve energy. However, once it starts to get warmer again, we move into spring. The bats start to come out of hibernation and move into what we call transitional roosts, because they're in between. They're just somewhere to stop off for a little while. So in spring, we get the bats moving into transitional roosts, building up their body condition again. And then as we move into summer, we find them moving into breeding roosts, certainly the breeding females anyhow. After they finish their breeding cycle, they will then move into transitional roosts again in autumn, which is also the time in which they mate before going back into hibernation. So that's a very quick year in the life of a bat. Now let's look at that again in a bit more detail and looking at some examples of the roosts that bats will use at these different times of year. So again, starting in winter, we call bat roosts in winter hibernacular, simply because that's where they're hibernating. Hibernation, of course, is what we call an extended period of torpor. Now, torpor is a physiological state that bats use, where, as I described before, they reduce all their body systems right down to bare minimal. They are also able to reduce their body temperature uniquely down to ambient temperature. Bats are the only mammals that can voluntarily control their body temperature. Now, this enables them to conserve the energy that they've stored in the autumn, which sees them through the winter where there's no food available and into the spring when they can become active again. So it's very important for bats that they have very stable conditions during the winter. So we're looking for somewhere that's got a low temperature. Usually it varies slightly from species to species, but usually we're looking at something about 5 degrees Celsius. So that's about the same as your fridge, basically. The fridge through in your kitchen, that runs at about 5 degrees. And that is the temperature that most of our British bats like to be at. And the temperature also to which they can lower their body temperature, which, considering their active temperature is the same as ours, so 37 degrees, that's a massive, massive decrease. That's 22 degrees difference. So that's a significant difference. And to go from resting torpid temperature of, say, 5 degrees up to an active temperature of 37, it takes the bats about half an hour to warm up to get to active state. And that costs them about 10 days of energy. So it's very important that not only do they find somewhere within stable environmental conditions of low temperature, high humidity, but also somewhere where disturbance is going to be very low as well. Because obviously every time a bat is woken up, or I mean, they will wake up naturally throughout hibernation as well, but every time a bat is woken up, it loses potentially 10 days off of its hibernation time. Now that could be the difference. Say a bat's woken up 3 times through disturbance in the winter. That's 30 days. That's a month. That's the difference between, say, waking up at the end of March when things are starting to get warmer, or the beginning of March when potentially, certainly has been the last couple of years, there's been snow on the ground and certainly no food available for them to replenish that lost energy. So it's very important that the sites they use have low levels of disturbance as well as stable environmental conditions. We find them using underground sites an awful lot for winter roosts. So we've got some examples here. This is an old limestone quarry down in Dorset. This is a limestone mine limestone, I think it's a limestone mine, here in Midlothian. This is old wartime defences, actually, again, down south. And you can see here they've been grilled. This is a structure that's used by greater horseshoe bats. Now, the grill prevents people from getting in and potentially being harmed in the environment. But the holes, as you can see, are more than adequate for the horseshoe bats to fly in and out. What have we got here? This is an old railway tunnel with a lovely domed roof, lots of nice crevices in between the rocks, the stones there where the mortars come out. And particularly up here in Scotland, we find a lot of historic properties, historic buildings are used by bats through the winter. You may recognise Doune Castle here, very nice hibernacular for pipistrelle species, also for a couple of myotis species, things like Dobentons and Natteras, brown long-eared, they've all been found hibernating there. And just because I thought it'd be nice to have a few bats rather than just all pictures of structures, this is a little brown long-eared in hibernation. And you can see that's the ear there. They tuck their ears away when they're hibernating. They tuck them down the side of their body, between the body and the wing, to keep them safe from the cold. So as they move out of hibernation, as the weather starts to warm up and they become more active, they move into what we call transitional roosts. So these are just relatively random stopping off points, somewhere to tuck up and keep yourself warm for a couple of nights. So these can be anywhere. We find bats all over the place in these transitional roosts. So we've got, this is a nice little bark plate flaking off of a tree here, nice little cavity in there, could keep a pip warm for a couple of nights. We've got some wooden cladding on the side of this building. There's a wee bandit pip tucked up in there. Rock faces, we're discovering more and more about bats and their use of rock faces. Traditionally, of course, they probably would have used them a lot more than we now recognize. There's a new book, in fact, coming out later this month, which I'm very much looking forward to, all about bats and rock faces. But we're looking more and we're finding more in terms of bats using rock faces. Possibly one of my favorite transitional roosts that I've ever found is this one. This is, this is down in Galloway. We were on a long excursion with the Edinburgh Natural History Society and looking at the information board, and where's my mouse gone? There we go. And in this gap here, you can see there's like a double skin, open but double skin side to this. We found droppings in the bottom. There were no bats actually in it at the time, but a very nice little transitional roost. It was probably, well, you can see it was maybe a couple of foot deep. So they could tuck in there quite nicely. And also boxes, again, bat boxes are used quite a lot in spring as transitional roosts. What we also find in spring are what we call gathering roosts. Now, these are later on in spring, just before we move into batty summer. And this is where we get groups of females starting to come together, smallish groups, which we think these are groups of females who are going to go on to form maternity roosts together. And they're just starting to gather. So they're starting to pre-maternity roost gather. You might think of it like it's an antenatal class almost. You've got all the expectant mums coming together in small groups before they all go off to the maternity ward, because that's what happens next. Well, for breeding females anyway. Males and some of the non-breeding females will continue to use these kind of transitory roosts all through the summer. The males don't take part in the maternity roosts at all for most species. It's just the breeding females. And maternity roosts can be quite prosaic, really. They can be in all sorts of places. Certainly for pipistrelles, when we get these sometimes quite large, I mean, soprano pipistrelles can form colonies of into the hundreds. But we've got the females coming together in these large colonies to give birth to, they just have the one pup a year. They're not like the traditional flying rodents idea. They're not, they don't breed like rodents. They have one pup once a year, which is one of the reasons why they have such a long lifespan. Our little pipistrelles, which is our most widespread and abundant, the one you're likely to see zipping around your garden, they can live for up to 15 years if they survive their first year. Average lifespan is of course a lot lower, but if you take out first year mortality, you can get a wee pip for living for about 15 years, which is quite remarkable. Some of our other species can live 30, 40 years. Absolutely mind-blowing for something so small, quite remarkable. So it makes maternity roosts very vulnerable. It makes them very important roosts because you have this large gathering of females, not just a lot of bats in one place at one time, but also creating the next generation. If you have an event, a negative event at a maternity roost, you can not just lose that group of females, but you lose that whole group of recruitment into the next generation as well. So bats are quite vulnerable when they're in their maternity roosts. Pipistrelles particularly, very urban bats, they like buildings. They like our domestic dwellings. Most of these are all pipistrelle roosts that I've known. This is a block of flats. Where's my cursor? Come back, here we go. Not so far from me, the bats were tucked up here under this cladding. It was quite interesting. You could see droppings on all these windows here, ground floor, first floor, second floor. But these windows up on the top here were all clear because the bats were accessing the roost around about here. So all the poo was hitting these windows, but of course not these ones because they were above it. This is another urban roost. Bats were up going in the soffit here. This is an ex-local authority property. Again, they were tucking up in here between the slates and the sarking. Dormers, they love flat roof dormers. They do get nice and warm, these structures, and that's just what pips are looking for their maternity roost, as are most species when it comes to maternity roosts. They like it nice and cold and humid in the winter, but hot and pretty humid is good in the summer as well. Because when the young are born, like humans, they're not able to thermoregulate. So they need a nice warm environment to get them going. Now, these two properties, this one, I'm sure lots of you will recognize. This is, of course, Vogrie House. These old sort of Victorian era properties with nice big roof spaces. These are loved by brown long-eareds. They like to do warm-up flights before they go outside. So they really like these big old structures with nice big attic spaces that they can fly around in before they come out. They're very slow flying bats. As bats go, they're slow flying. They still zip past you, but as bats go, they're slow flying. So they tend to wait and come out when it's a lot darker. So they like to do these warm-up flights before they come out. Other species are much quicker on the wing and are much happier to come out when it's less dark and to sort of just get going from cold. Of course, it's not just domestic dwellings that bats use. They use lots of other structures as well, particularly other species. Pipistrelles very much dependent on our dwelling houses for their roosts, but other species not so much so. So just to give you a flavour of a few, what will we start? Let's start here. This is an aqueduct out in West Lothian, and you might just see the inspection hatch here with its little envelope. This is a Dorbenton's maternity roost. There was about 40 or 50 bats using that through the summer to raising their youngsters. Another Dorbenton's roost, and again in West Lothian, this is a tree roost. This is a beech tree, and you can see here this is an old knot hole. Rot has set in and a cavity has formed up in the trunk behind it. and that had 20, 30 bats maternity roosting in there. Where will we go next? Let's go north. This is up a Torridon Way. I was doing some survey work up there. When I saw this at first, this is metal cladding on the roof here, and I thought that's not going to be much good. But when I went in and looked up, it was all wooden rafters and joists. And in fact, we found a small brown long-eared colony using that. This is also a brown long-eared roost, but another tree one. You can see there's been a split in the trunk here. And again, a cavity had formed up on top of it, or rather above it. And that was used as a brown long-eared maternity roost. This is again somewhere that the locals among you may recognize. This is Crichton Castle, a very good hibernacular site as well. We get Storbentons, Natterers, brown long-eared, pipistrelles, all hibernating in there. It's one of the few places where we know about hibernating pipistrelles. They tend to vanish in the winter, but that's another story. But it's also a Natterer's maternity roost. A lot of historic buildings, certainly here in Scotland, are used widely throughout the year by bats, and they just make some great habitat. So it's always worth, if you're having a look around a castle or a palace, keep your torch and have a look for bat droppings while you're there. Heading further south, this is another Natterer's roost. This is a church down in Shropshire, has a lovely population of Natterers. We don't tend to have so many church roosts up here in Scotland. We seem to have more in historic buildings, fewer in churches. Whereas when you go south, they seem to be fewer in historic buildings, but an awful lot using churches as well, which is particularly Myotis species. So things like Natterers, Storbentons, Whiskered, Brants, etc. And in some cases, they can cause some problems. They will also fly around inside. And of course, when they're doing that, they're defecating and urinating, which can cause a few problems. But thankfully, we don't tend to have to deal with that up here. And finally, this is an example of an unusual pipistrelle roost. You may recognize this structure for what it is. It's a bird hide. This is again down in Galloway. I think it was on Kendee Marshes. And they were tucked up under this soffit board and in the roof void. It's a flat roof, but there was a gap between layers of it, and they were tucked up in there. I was sitting in there watching the birds, and I thought, I swear I can hear bats. And I thought, I've been doing too much bat work this summer, and I'm starting to imagine it. But no, sure enough, there were indeed bats. It was a small maternity roost of, I think it was bandit pipistrelle, up using that roof space. So they can turn up all over the place, but we're most likely to encounter them when they're in domestic dwellings in urban settings. Now, this is also the time and the habitat where it's easiest for us as citizen scientists to get involved and to monitor our bat populations. Now, you may have come across the National Bat Monitoring Programme. This is a programme that's been going now for about 25 years, and it's run by the Bat Conservation Trust. And one of their surveys, as part of the National Bat Monitoring Programme, they have a range of different surveys, some which you need some quite extensive training for. Others, like the sunset sunrise, anybody can do. And it is a lovely survey to do, it has to be said. It's ideal for people who are beginning, they're beginners, they're just sort of natural interest in bats, not much knowledge necessarily, and not necessarily much experience, but you've got an interest, this is the one for you. It's now running from April through to September, so throughout the bat's active period. And the idea is you go out at dusk. You don't even have to go out. You could do it from your window, your balcony, your garden, your local green space, take a donder around the streets of your town, anything you like. Just get out there or look out there and look for nocturnal wildlife and record what you see. Now, it's a great one to do because it's really nice to get out at dusk. I love going out at dusk. I think there's a different feel to the atmosphere and the environment, and everything's just that wee bit more chilled. So it's lovely to go out and look for things that you wouldn't necessarily normally see. But the other aspect of this, of course, is the dawn bit, the sunrise bit. Now, hands up, I'm not a morning person, but there's one reason why it's always worth getting up at dawn, and that is if you see something like this. Now, let's get this working. Hopefully this is going to work. There we go. This is a behaviour called dawn swarming, and this is something we see at maternity roosts sometimes. Now, this is just before it starts to get light, when the bats are finally coming back at the end of their active night. And instead of just going zip and straight into their roost, you get this fabulous dance. It's a bat ceilidh. They're all burling about. To see this is just quite amazing. It's something that everyone should see. It's like starling murmurations, you know, everybody should always see one of these things. And it's a great way. If you see this, if you go out at dawn and you're wandering the streets of your village or your town, and you see bats burling about like this, you know that you've found a roost, and that's a brilliant record to get. Just to give you an idea of what was found last year, you can see this is the range where the surveys were done last year. Lots of surveys done. It was a brilliant participation rates last year, and lots of fabulous things seen. Lots of non-bat species seen as well. So it's a really nice way to get out and experience your local environment in a slightly different way. Definitely worth taking part. Now, moving finally into autumn. Autumn is when bats mate. They have a unique system of delayed fertilization. So although they will mate in autumn, the females will store the sperm over winter. And then come the spring, and when they've come out of hibernation, they've built up their body condition again, they've got themselves in good condition, they will then ovulate, release the sperm, that will fertilize the egg, and they will then become pregnant. So in autumn, we find two things going on. Our British bats use two different strategies. We have mating roosts, things like the pipistrelles, noctules, liselers. The males will set up a territory, often in a tree or in a bat box. This is when we find bat boxes being used quite a lot. And they will sing, they will fly around their little territory, singing their hearts out, trying to attract the females in. And they'll try and attract as many females as they can into their mating roost, and then, of course, mate with them. And that's that. The other technique that's used, or strategy rather, that's used, is what's called swarming. Now, this often takes place near hibernation sites because it's very energy demanding. So things like historic buildings or mines, caves, quarries, anywhere that the bats might use for hibernation is where you'll tend to find swarming. Now, this is similar to like a lecking behavior that we see in things like black grouse. The males will come together in relatively large numbers, and we see this in Myotis species, brown long-eared, barbastelle, these kind of species, and they will burl about. They will strut their funky stuff as much as they can for a period throughout the autumn. The females and the males will be there every night, strutting their stuff. The females will attend once or twice. They'll choose their male, they'll do the deed, and then that's it. So they can go back to storing up energy to see them through the winter. We find that female bats tend to go into hibernation in much better condition than the males because they don't have that much to do in the autumn. Their intense period is spring and summer when they're pregnant and then raising the youngsters. In autumn, all they need to do is mate a couple of times, and that's them sorted. The males don't do much in spring and summer, but in the autumn, they're highly intensely using up energy with their mating, be it mating roosts or swarming sites, whichever strategy they're using. They put a lot of energy into that. So we find females go into hibernation in better condition, which means, of course, when they come out the other side, it's quicker for them to get into a condition where they can ovulate and then become pregnant. So just to summarize that, because there's no reason not to have a nice chart when you get the opportunity, at the beginning of the year, we've got bats in hibernation. Around about March, April time, they'll move into transitional roosts. The females will then move into maternity roosts, where they will give birth and raise their youngsters. We'll then see bats using transitional roosts again and mating roosts or swarming sites, depending on the species, before around about October, November time, going back into hibernacula. So we see bats moving through a range of different roosts as the year progresses. Now, I like this slide for a couple of reasons. This is Doune Castle again here. This is Doune. So what do we know about Doune? Well, we know it's a good hibernation site. We know it's also used as a maternity roost. What else have we got here? We've got a maternity brown long-eared colony here. We know that there's pips maternity roosting in the village. We've got some nice pasture here that's good for foraging over. We've got some grassland that's good for foraging. We've got some arable that's good for foraging. We've got a river, of course, great for Daubentons. We've got some nice hedgerows. We've got trees. Trees are going to have roosting opportunities as well as foraging opportunities. There's lots going on here, but the most important thing is that they're all connected. And that is what's vital when it comes to bat conservation. It's not just protecting a roost, but it's protecting that connectivity, that landscape level connectivity of these different roosts. I'm going to finish up now. I'm running out of time. I'm going to finish up by giving you something that a friend said to me not so long ago. We were talking about roosts and importance of roosts and how did you know which roosts were more important and so forth. And he likened it to chairs in your house. Now just take a moment and think about your house and think about the chairs you have. You'll probably have your armchairs in your living room, somewhere nice and comfy to sit with a book and a coffee or watching telly. Chairs in the dining room, perhaps, somewhere, or at the kitchen table, somewhere to sit and eat. Desk chairs, I think we've all got those these days. Probably a couple of spare chairs kicking around that you only use when those far-flung relatives come and bump the numbers up. Garden furniture, perhaps you've got maybe a picnic set or something like that. Now, all of these chairs are important to you for different reasons. And all of these chairs will be used at different times. Maybe something like your desk chair or your armchair, that's used most days, and that's quite important. But then your garden furniture, maybe you only use that once or twice a year, but when you do use it, it's important that you have it. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't be able to enjoy your outdoor space perhaps quite so much. So it's very hard to actually put a value on these different roosts if we think of them like that. And that's what we need to bear in mind when we're talking about bats, bat conservation, roost conservation. Different roosts have different importance to the bats at different times of year. I realize I'm slightly straying here because I'm about to go off on a wild tangent, so I shall rein myself back because I'm running out of time. But we know that bats will move based on environmental conditions. So if it's a particularly hot year, they'll use a different maternity roost. If it's particularly cold, they'll use a different maternity roost. They'll move if weather conditions change. We know that some of the tree roosting species won't just use one roost for a maternity roost. They'll have a dozen or more that they'll move between, taking their youngsters with them. So it's very hard to say these are the important roosts. What we need to do is to be able to look at them and say, well, they're all important for their own reason. And the important thing that we can do as conservationists is to maintain as many of them we can, and also to maintain the connectivity that allows bats to move between them and to use what suits them at the time, for the time of year and for the environmental conditions. So I'm going to draw to a close. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like to find out more about bats, please do have a look at the Bat Conservation Trust website. There's some brilliant resources on there, lots of great information. If you feel the urge to learn more about bats, then you can always check out, there's various online training available, including stuff that I do with Tragus Training. Feel free to have a look us up and have a look at that. And finally, obviously it's not going to work, this is a recording, but if anyone has any questions, do please feel free to email me. You can get in touch with me via Lothian Bat Group. We're on Facebook and on Twitter. And that's it. So I should just say once more, thank you very much for inviting me along this morning. I hope you've enjoyed this, and as I say, please do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you.